There was a haunted house where every night a bloody head fell down the chimney. At least that's what people said. So nobody would stay there overnight. Then a rich man offered $200 to whoever would do it. And this boy said he would try if he could have his dog with him. So it was all settled. The very next night the boy went to the house with his dog. To make it more cheerful, he started a fire in the fireplace. He then sat in front of the fire and waited, and his dog waited with him. For a while nothing happened, but a little after midnight he heard someone singing softly and sadly in the woods, and the song sounded something like this. Me tie do ti walker. It's just somebody singing, the boy said to himself, but he was frightened. Then the dog answered the song. Softly and sadly it sang, Lynchy, Kinchy, Collie, Molly, Dingo, Dingo. The boy could not believe his ears. His dog had never uttered a word before. Then, a few minutes later, he heard singing again. Now it was closer and louder, but the words were just the same. Me tie doty walker. This time the boy tried to stop his dog from answering. He was afraid that whoever was singing would hear it and come after them, but his dog paid no attention, and again it sang, Lynchy, Kinchy, Collie, Molly, Dingo, Dingo. A half hour later the boy heard the singing again. Now it was in the backyard, and the song was the same. Me tie doty walker. Again, the boy tried to keep his dog quiet, but the dog sang louder than ever. Lynchy, Kinchy, Collie, Molly, Dingo, Dingo. Soon, the boy heard the singing again, and it was coming down the chimney. Me tie doty walker. The dog sang right back. Lynchy, Kinchy, Collie, Molly, Dingo, Dingo. Then, suddenly, a head fell out of the chimney. It missed the fire and landed right next to the dog. The dog took one look and fell over, dead from fright. The head turned and stared at the boy. Slowly, it opened its mouth and... Ah! A man who lived in Leeds. Some say this rhyme doesn't mean anything. Others are not so sure. There was a man who lived in Leeds. He filled his garden full of seeds, and when the seeds began to grow, it was like a garden filled with snow, and when the snow began to melt, it was like a ship without a belt, and when the ship began to sail, it was like a bird without a tail, and when the bird began to fly, it was like an eagle in the sky, and when the sky began to roar, it was like a lion at my door. And when the door began to crack, it was like a penknife in my back. And when my back began to bleed, I was dead. Dead indeed. Ah! Old woman all skin and bones. There was an old woman all skin and bones who lived near the graveyard all alone. Ooh. She thought she'd go to church one day to hear the parson preach and pray. Ooh. And when she came to church house style, she thought she'd stop and rest a while. Ooh. And when she came up to the door, she thought she'd stop and rest some more. Ooh. And when she turned and looked around, she saw a corpse upon the ground. Ooh. And from its nose down to its chin, the worms crawled out and the worms crawled in. Ooh. The woman said to the preacher, Shall I look like this when I am dead? Ooh. The preacher to the woman said, You'll look like this when you are dead. Ah! The Thing. Ted Martin and Sam Miller were good friends. They spent a lot of time together. On this particular night, they were sitting on a fence near the post office talking about one thing and another. There was a field of turnips across the road. Suddenly, they saw something crawl out of the field and stand up. It looked like a man, but in the dark, it was hard to tell for sure. Then it was gone. And soon it appeared again. It walked halfway across the road, then it turned around and went back to the field. Then it came out a third time and started toward them. By now, Ted and Sam were scared and they started running, but when they finally stopped, they decided they were being foolish. They weren't even sure what had scared them, so they decided to go back and get a better look. Pretty soon they saw it, for it was coming to meet them. It was wearing black pants, a white shirt, and black suspenders. Sam said, "I'm going to try to touch it, then we'll know if it's real." He walked up to it and peered into its face. It had bright, penetrating eyes sunken deep in its head. It looked like a skeleton. Ted took one look and screamed, and again he and Sam ran, but this time the skeleton followed them. And when they reached Ted's house, they stood in the doorway and watched it. It stayed out in the road for a while, then it disappeared. A year later, Ted got sick and died. Towards the end, Sam sat up with him every night. That night Ted died, Sam looked just like that skeleton. The White Wolf. The timber wolves around French Creek had gotten out of hand. There were so many wolves, the farmers could not stop them from killing their cattle and sheep, so the state put a bounty on them. It would pay a hunter $10 for every wolf pelt he turned in. A butcher in town named Bill Williams thought that it was pretty good money. He stopped working as a butcher and started killing wolves. He was good at it. Every year he killed over 500 of them. It came to more than $5,000. It was quite a bit of money in those days. After 4 or 5 years, Bill had killed so many wolves, there were hardly any left in that area. So he retired and he vowed to never harm another wolf because wolves had made him rich. Then one day, a farmer reported that a white wolf had killed 2 of his sheep. He had shot at it and hit it, but the bullets didn't have any effect. Soon, the wolf was seen all over the countryside, killing and running, and nobody could stop it. One night, it came into Bill's yard, and it killed his pet cow. Bill forgot about his decision to never harm another wolf. He went into town the next morning and brought a young lamb for bait. He took it out into the hills and tied it to a tree. Then he backed off about 50 yards and sat down under another tree. With his gun in his lap, he waited. When Bill didn't come back, his friends started looking for him. Finally, they found the lamb. It was still tied to a tree. It was hungry, but it was alive. Then they found Bill. He was sitting against the other tree, but he was dead. His throat had been torn open. But there was no sign of a struggle. His gun hadn't even been fired. There were no tracks in the soil around him. As for the white wolf, it was never seen again. The Haunted House. One time, a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in his settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they always would get scared out by the haunt. So the preacher took his Bible and went to the house, went on in, built himself a good fire, and lit a lamp, sat there reading the Bible. Then, just before midnight, he heard something start up in the cellar, walking back and forth, back and forth. Then it started like somebody was starting to scream and got choked off. Then there were a lot of thrashing around and struggling, and finally everything got quiet. The old preacher took out his Bible again, But before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back easy-like, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened the Bible and read a while. Then he got up and laid the book on the chair and went to mending the fire. Then the haunt started walking again, and step, step, step up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door and saw the doorknob turn and the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed like she didn't know what to do. Then she just faded out. The old preacher waited and waited, and he didn't hear any more noises. And he went over and shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he was a brave man, and he thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and he sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the haunt start up again, slowly. Step, 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 step. Closer and closer. Step, step. And it was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible out before him. Then the knob slowly turned and the door opened wide. This time the preacher spoke quiet-like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are you and what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room, straight to him, and took hold of his coat. It was a young woman about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled. Her flesh was dropping off her face, and so he could see the bones and part of her teeth. She had no eyeballs, but there was a sort of blue light way back in the eye sockets, and she had no nose to her face. And then she started talking, and it sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind blowing. She told how her lover had killed her for her money and buried her in the cellar. She said if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could rest. Then she told him to take the end joint of the little finger of her left hand and lay it in the collection plate at the church meeting, and he'd find out who had murdered her. And she said, "If you come back here once more after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where my money is hid, and you can give it to the church." The haunt sobbed like she was tired, and she sunk down towards the floor and was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate, and when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at the bone, trying to get it off like crazy. Then he went to screaming like he was going crazy. Well, he confessed to the murder, and they took him to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to the house one midnight, and Hans's voice told him to dig under the hearthrug. He did, and he found a big sack of money, and where the haunt had held on to his coat, the print of those bony fingers were burned right into the cloth, and it never did come out.